Good morning, everybody. Some of you may know me. My name is John Stewart, and I would like to tell you a story this morning which I stole from Jesus. Jesus tells a story about two builders, and they both built they built this house. They built two houses, and one of them dug down deep and built on a rock foundation, but the other one didn't. In fact, he built straight onto the sand, and it was a total disaster because the heavens opened and a torrent came down, and the man who built just on sand, his house was totally washed away. And as I thought about this story, I thought, yeah, that would make an excellent children's story. So there, in my story, there's two boys. I call them Bert and Bodget. And they were two very different children, very different in nature. Bert was very, very precise in everything that he did. It had to be just right. Whereas Bodget used to like doing the same things, but he wasn't really as careful. And they used to live in Israel on, in those days, what was called the Great Sea, but we now call it the Mediterranean. And so they spent a lot of time together on the shores of the Mediterranean or the Great Sea, and they loved to build sandcastles. And one day they were building this fantastic castle, sandcastle, just as you'd probably done. And Bert said to Bodget, you know, when I grow up, I am going to build the best houses in the whole of Israel. Yeah, said Bodget, and people are going to come from everywhere to buy my houses, and they're going to be absolutely brilliant. Well, I like to build castles as well. Well, I like to build houses. I would like to, said Bodget. Perhaps I'm not as finicky as you, but I still like to build. Why don't we form a company and work together? Now, Bert thought about this, and inside he thought, I liked mine to be precise. Anyway, they grew up, these two children, and they did form a company for themselves, and they both had an ambition that one day they would each buy a plot of land and build their own houses on this land. Anyway, they began to work, and frankly, Bodget wasn't as careful. They worked together on building houses, but unfortunately Bert, who was very precise, each stone that they got from the quarry he'd cut and chip away until it was beautifully square before he actually put the mortar on to set it in its place. Whereas Bodget, well, he was something else. He just put it on, lar up on the mortar, and Bert would look at some of the stones that he put. They weren't even in line, and he would say, Bodget, look, come on, man, look at that stone. That's dreadful. And he said, well, you're too finicky. You're so precise. We'll never get rich the way you work. You're like a snail builder. That's what you are. Well, the trouble is, poor old Bert took this to heart in a way. And so he would wait after work till Bodget had gone home, and he would sometimes knock out the stone that Bodget had put in crooked or whatever and reset it before he went home. He loved his friend, but it just didn't work. And one day, it was a hot day, and he fizzed, just like a lemonade bottle that had been shaken. Suddenly he couldn't take anything else because Bodgett had criticised something he'd done, calling him slow and the sort of thing. Anyway, they argued. Bodgett said they would never ever be able to form a company because they were so different, and Bert said, well, that's true. We wouldn't really. You're not as careful as you should be, because it doesn't work, and I've had to correct a lot of the stuff that you built. And of course at that, Bodgett really blew his top and said, right, we'll go our own ways. And Bert said, yes, I think we should, because we're very different. And anyway, I think our friendship is suffering because of the differences there are between us. And so they separated and they formed their own companies. Bert's company was called Divine Developments, and he'd be there chipping away, cutting the stone beautifully square before he took it to the building site and starting. And his little girl, Rebecca, was sat there watching him one day, and she said, Daddy, why is it that you take so long to chip away at stone, whereas Uncle Bodgett, he doesn't. He just puts it on and he works so very fast. Yes, said her dad, and he gets lots of visitors. Well, having visitors, that's a good thing, said his daughter. Well, I don't think Uncle Bodgett would see it quite like that, because the visitors that they have come to complain. Anyway, poor old Bodgett, he did have crowds of people complaining that great cracks had appeared in the houses that he built, and they had lumpy, bumpy outsides, and well, they were very unhappy with them. But as soon as that began to happen, Bodgett would change the name of his company, and instead of Divine Developments, like Bert's company had become, he'd call it Cowboy Contractors, or voice-like names of that sort of thing. And he would take the stone, he wouldn't cut it true, and things began to be a disaster. Anyway, after many years, they both saved enough money to buy a building plot each. And on that day, they stood there, having realised that their ambition as small boys had been realised. And so they shook hands together, and Bodgett said, do you know, my house will be finished in about 4 weeks. 4 weeks, said Bert. This is your house. Surely not. I couldn't possibly build a house in that time. And old Bodgett probably raised one eyebrow, as much as to say, no, I know how slow you are. Anyway, they started building, and Bodgett came over, and he said, is that as far as you've got? But Bert was digging right down to the rock foundation, which he knew was beneath the sand. And he said he was laughing and joking with him and pulling fun at him, really. He said, well, when are you going to start on your house, said Bert. Well, I'll start today, I think, said Bodgett, and I'll be finished in about 4 weeks. Oh, yeah, said Bert. Anyway, he continued working, and eventually both of them finished their houses. One was on one side of the river and one was built on the other. There was a vast difference. Anyway, the winter came the clouds came thick and fast and down, and suddenly the rain started like stair rods. They came down, the sand was pitted everywhere, and so much rain that the river began to rise up and rise up. And the mountains which were beyond them, suddenly there was a noise like 1,000 horses drumming down. And this great wall of water came, push, and hit against Bert's house. But the thing was, he built on a rock foundation. It didn't even shudder. He and his wife and little Rebecca went to the top of the house, and they looked as this great torrent was pouring past the house. And Rebecca said something like, "Daddy, it's just very frightening." He said, "You've got nothing to worry about, my little one. I built this house on a firm foundation. You've got nothing to fear." And what about Uncle Bodgett's house? I know. We'll go over and see what's happened in the morning. Anyway, poor old Bodgett. This great torrent struck his house at exactly the same time as Bert's. But instead of the house resisting, the sand had been washed away from underneath the bricks, and the whole house collapsed. In the morning, the storm had gone, the clouds had disappeared, the rain had stopped. And Bert, his wife, and little Rebecca went over to have a look. And when they got there, there was just a heap of stones and timber. They both looked. Rebecca's little doll was at the side of a puddle, reflecting and quivering. Rebecca said, "Daddy, what's happened?" Bert said, "Uncle Bodgett had no foundation to his house, and it's totally disappeared and collapsed." "Where are they?" "That's anyone's guess," Daddy said. "I really don't know, but the whole thing's a tragedy." Jesus knew loads about building work. You see, people often think of him as a carpenter, which he was, of course, and perhaps making little three-legged stools or tables or chairs, whatever. But you see, I believe in those days, builders or carpenters had both skills, and he's probably worked on quite a few building sites, putting in rafters, etc. So he knew about how buildings should be worked. And this is what Jesus said in Luke chapter 6 and verse 46 to 49. "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? I will show you what he is like who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice. He's like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When the flood came, the torrent struck that house but couldn't shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and doesn't put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete."